For every nation, there are battles whose names for one reason or another mean more to their people than most. For Americans, it's Gettysburg. For Australians and New Zealanders, it's Gallipoli. For the British and Canadians, it's the Somme. For France, perhaps one of the most important battles in its recent history was the Battle of Verdun. Fought almost throughout the entirety of 1916, the battle was instigated by the German army in an effort to destroy France and achieve victory on the Western Front. Instead, the battle demonstrated France's determination to resist and fight back over the span of 303 days of fighting, one of the longest battles not just of the Great War, but in recorded history. This is the bloody story of the Battle of Verdun. Welcome to Wars of the World. December 1915. Despite both sides promising their people the war would be over by the previous Christmas, it had continued to become bogged down in a brutal and bloody slog. On the Western Front, a complex web of trenches had been cut through the Belgian and French countryside, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Both sides were locked in a tug of war to decisively break the deadlock. For the Central Powers, their effort in this regard was frustrated by them having to fight Imperial Russia on the Eastern Front. Germany, with their Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman allies, had successfully launched a massive offensive in the early months of the year, expelling Russian forces from modern-day Poland and into Russian territory, where they were eventually stopped, but not before penetrating well over 100 kilometers, or 62 miles, into Russia. As the year began to wind down, the chief of the German Great General Staff, General of Infantry Erich von Falkenhayn, decided to reassess Germany's position. Despite stalling in the east, he had achieved his primary goal on that front by securing Germany's eastern border from the forces of Tsar Nicholas II. He was also acutely aware of the revolutionary sentiment in Russia, which had only been fueled by their army's failures in the war, and he believed that Russia would likely be out of the war in the following year, as they collapsed into their own civil war. Now all he had to do was dig in with a blocking force to hold the Russians back while he redeployed the bulk of his troops back to the Western Front, where he believed the war would be won or lost. On Christmas Day 1915, the general wrote a letter to German ruler Kaiser Wilhelm II, outlining the strategic picture as he saw it going into 1916, listing his recommendations of how they should proceed to achieve victory. In this letter, he described the French army as being on the verge of collapse, and one good offensive against a French target would break them, specifically targeting an area which he knew the French would have to commit to. Therefore, the biggest threat as he saw it came from Britain and its empire, which afforded the island nation a wealth of men and resources which were out of reach of the armies of the Central Powers. To nullify the threat of Great Britain, he proposed that German submarines began a campaign of unrestricted warfare against British shipping in order to strangle Britain into submission, while his troops forced the French army to commit to battle, where they could be ground down into defeat. The Kaiser, however, was reluctant to authorize the resumption of this policy, as earlier in the year a German U-boat had sunk the passenger liner RMS Lusitania on May 7, 1915, an act which killed a number of Americans, souring relations with the United States and threatening to bring them into the war on the side of the Triple Entente against Germany. The Kaiser didn't want to risk provoking Washington further by killing more American citizens traveling on British passenger ships, and so he refused to authorize the resumption of the tactic, instead focusing his fleet on wresting control of the North Sea from the Royal Navy, which at that time was blockading Germany's own ports. He did, however, support von Falkenhayn's plan against the French. With the Kaiser's blessing, von Falkenhayn began scouting for the ideal location for his offensive. There were two main provisos for the targeted area, the first ensuring that it was tactically advantageous for the German forces, and secondly, to be important enough for the French to commit to its defense. Poring over intelligence reports from the front, he found what he was looking for in the city of Verdun, whose name means green knoll, providing a particularly fortified position for the French. Verdun had significant historical and cultural importance to the French, as well as both Germany and Europe itself. Signed in 843 AD, the Treaty of Verdun divided the Frankish Empire into 3 kingdoms, which would be shared out with Lothair I, Louis II, and Charles II, the surviving sons of the Emperor Louis I, the son and successor of Emperor Charlemagne. This treaty provided the geographical genesis of what would become the nations of France and Germany. Additionally, Verdun had been the scene of 2 major sieges between the 2 nations over the previous centuries. Although ominously for Falkenhayn, both had resulted in French victories. Verdun had continued its role defending France in 1915, with it being the easternmost French position, with it consisting of a series of small fortifications during the Battle of the Marne. But by the beginning of 1916, these were being served by just a single thin trench line to the north and east of the main fortifications. There were simply not enough men remaining to occupy the thick woods immediately opposite their position, which von Falkenhayn reasoned his troops could use to move into position undetected prior to the start of their assault. Secrecy would be key to their success, for the French clearly weren't anticipating a major move against Verdun at that time, with them having redeployed some of their field artillery away from the area in the waning months of 1915. Von Falkenhayn hoped to take advantage of this fact by striking out in force, capturing the region and digging in, while the French threw their forces at them in a counter-offensive. German artillery would then wear down these counter-attacking French troops, turning the countryside around Verdun into a meat grinder. It was a logical plan that, in his words, he believed would bleed France white, and to further guarantee the Kaiser's continued support, he suggested that this pivotal battle should be commanded by his son, Crown Prince Wilhelm, whose 5th Army was positioned on Verdun's right flank. Surrounding Verdun is the Meuse River, which runs northwards before emptying into the North Sea. Crown Prince Wilhelm concocted a plan whereby his troops would assault Verdun from both sides of the river, aiming to capture the fortified French positions to the north. However, von Falkenhayn disapproved and vetoed the plan, instead ordering the Crown Prince to focus his attack on the eastern bank. Von Falkenhayn argued that not only was Wilhelm's plan too risky, with the Meuse potentially becoming a natural barrier dividing their forces, but that also that Wilhelm had missed the point. Wilhelm was thinking on the tactical level of winning a battle. However, von Falkenhayn was thinking purely on the strategic level to win the war. For him, territorial gains were a bonus, the real objective being to kill as many French troops as possible. But in the coming months, the lack of clear objectives from von Falkenhayn would hinder Wilhelm's campaign. In preparation for the offensive, Wilhelm's 5th Army was reinforced with 3 corps of troops, with additional corps being assembled in reserve ready for the expected French counterattack. But key to success was to be the German artillery. A total of 1,201 artillery pieces were selected for the Verdun operation, and they were moved into position on freshly laid railroad tracks, which would also be used to continuously feed the guns ammunition. This allowed them to maintain a high rate of fire against the French forces, firing from 3 directions around the French position. An intricate telephone system was also set up, in order to give Wilhelm and his commanders the most up-to-date information, and enabling them to give instructions directly. This involved thousands of miles of telephone cables being strung out behind the German line. Such large-scale preparations did not go unnoticed by the British and French. In fact, intelligence agencies in Holland had already learned of von Falkenhayn's plan to break the French army as early as December 1915. And despite being formally neutral, the Dutch passed this information on to the British, but the picture was still incomplete. Additionally, French reconnaissance aircraft had identified increased activity near Verdun, but French forces under their commander-in-chief, General Joseph Joffre, were initially too preoccupied with preparing their own impending offensive to take much notice and respond. It was only on the eve of the initial German assault that Joffre began to act with some urgency, ordering troops to be redeployed to Verdun. In that regard, he was aided by poor weather, which forced Wilhelm to delay the start of the attack by over a week. But despite this advantage, the French were less than ideally prepared for what was to come. Dubbed Operation Gericht, meaning judgment, The plan called for an intense artillery barrage, which would see an unprecedented 100,000 shells fired per hour at French positions. In order to suppress counterfire from the French guns moved into the area, German forces would deploy phosphine gas canisters at their positions in order to kill or obstruct the French gun crews. The 1st Infantry would then advance and assess the success of the initial barrage, allowing Wilhelm to direct his guns and their formidable firepower where they were needed, rather than wasting shells blasting already destroyed positions. Follow-up troops would then move forward and attempt to capture the French forward trenches, as artillery pummeled their former occupants, having now retreated to their second-line trenches. This strategy set the standard for how von Falkenhayn wanted to conduct his campaign, limiting casualties among the German infantry as much as possible by making the artillery do much of the work. Ideally, the territory captured would force the French into kill boxes, making use of interlocking artillery fire to destroy these areas, while long-range artillery would continue to disrupt the supply and communication lines behind the front. Finally, on the morning of February 21st, 1916, the battle began. 07:15 hours. The peace of the early morning was shattered by an ungodly eruption of artillery, unlike that ever witnessed before in history. The very first shot came from a rail-based long-range German naval gun, which landed in the Bishop's Palace inside Verdun itself, blowing off a side of the cathedral wall. Over the next 9 hours, it seemed to pour down with explosive shells onto the French positions along a 20-kilometer front. The first line trench being so devastated by this onslaught that in some areas, as few as 1 in 5 French troops escaped unscathed. French efforts to coordinate a response were hampered by the total cutting of the French telephone network between their front and their headquarters. While in the air, some 168 German aircraft were deployed in the largest airborne protective screen for a military operation yet seen, to prevent the French from using their own reconnaissance aircraft to locate the German guns for a counter-barrage. 16:45 hours. After a staggering 1 million shells had been fired, the first German scouts had made their way out of the trenches and observed firsthand the devastation their guns had wrought on their enemy. However, beyond identifying the few remaining relatively intact sections of the line, they were under strict instructions from von Falkenhayn not to advance any further than necessary to coordinate the artillery against those positions until nightfall. The next day saw the resumption of the barrage, but Wilhelm's army added another horror to the French in the form of 96 troops equipped with flamethrowers. Again, the French suffered appalling casualties as they continued to struggle to coordinate an effective response. By day 3, German troops had moved forward to occupy the forwardmost French trenches, in some areas advancing as far as 2 miles from their starting point, taking over 3,000 French prisoners in the process. Such was the chaos for the French, that in one terrible instance, they bombarded their own troops by mistake in the town of Samono, opening it up for later German occupation. On day 4, the Germans struck a major blow when they captured Fort Douaumont with just a small group of soldiers from the German army's 24th Brandenburg Infantry Regiment. The troops entered Douaumont via an unguarded passageway, catching the garrison of 57 second-line French territorials completely by surprise, resulting in the fort falling without a single shot being fired. By now, the French line could no longer hold back the overwhelming force set against them, and the Germans were able to break through between Beaumont and Samono in their biggest gain in a single day of the battle so far. This breakthrough changed the nature of the battle as the French were pushed back. It was no longer a typical static battle between trenches, but rather a mobile fight as the Germans pursued the French across the countryside until they were just 2 miles from Verdun itself. With the situation deteriorating, Joffre sent his second-in-command, Edouard Noël de Castelnau, to Verdun to assess the situation. His response was to place General Henri-Philippe Pétain in command. This would prove a decisive move for the French, for Pétain rose to the challenge, resisting the more cautious opinions among the French that they should abandon Verdun and establish a new defensive line behind the city. He was exactly the type of opponent von Falkenhayn was hoping to face, a French general who insisted on holding the line at all costs, and thus Pétain appeared to be playing into his hands perfectly. However, Pétain was a logical officer, and one who cared about his men, and his decisions over the coming days and weeks would reflect this. Recognizing he was in a battle of attrition, Pétain made use of a narrow road, just 6 meters wide, which would later become known as the Sacred Way. This small road was used to transport in a steady stream of troops and supplies via some 3,500 trucks, which would then withdraw wounded troops on the return journey. At its peak, this vital supply line brought in 90,000 men as well as 50,000 tons of supplies each week. In order to avoid exhaustion amongst the men, Pétain also introduced the Noria system, where divisions were rotated in and out of the front lines every 15 days, or when they had lost 1/3 of their personnel. The battle, of course, was not confined to the ground. The skies over Verdun became a hive of air activity in support of the troops below, and this in turn led to a number of air combats, as both sides had then adopted dedicated fighter aircraft to destroy the enemy's machines. One man more than any other would become associated with the fighting over the battlefield at Verdun, namely Frenchman Jean Nivelle, who would earn the moniker the Sentinel of Verdun. From day one of the battle, he was in action against enemy aircraft, his own plane initially painted in the bright colours of the French flag, before he did something quite unique and adorned his Nieuport fighter in an all-over red paint scheme, so he was easily recognisable to his comrades on the ground, who often cheered at the sight of it. This was almost a full year before Manfred von Richthofen would do the same, the man who would become known as the Red Baron. With Wilhelm and Pétain now locked in their game of war, the question was, could one side sufficiently grind down the other to achieve victory? Under Pétain's stewardship, the French were able to effect a more credible response to the German attack. Despite being rather conspicuous by their absence in the opening rounds, by March, the French field guns were responding in kind, with barrages of their own, and while the Germans were still making gains in small bite-and-hold actions, they had lost much of their earlier momentum. On April 9th, German forces launched a major offensive on both sides of the Meuse, but it was only partially successful, as while the western force succeeded in pushing onto the slopes of Le Mortagne, where they would make repeated attacks to dislodge the French defenders there over the coming few months, those on the eastern bank made little headway by comparison. On April 30th, Pétain's success was rewarded with promotion, and he was replaced by Robert Nivelle. While Pétain was ideally suited to the defensive needs of the battle thus far, Nivelle was instead more aggressive in nature, looking to attack rather than just hold off the Germans. Upon taking command, he declared, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. But unfortunately, the French were still hemorrhaging troops, protecting Verdun just as von Falkenhayn had hoped. This was the source of frustration between Paris and their allies in London, the latter of whom were preparing for a summer offensive which the French were now pushing to be brought forward to ease the pressure on Verdun. The British agreed, and in conjunction with the French initiated the Battle of the Somme on July 1st, 1916. The first day of the offensive would go down in history as the bloodiest day in the British Army's history. But as it progressed, it succeeded in relieving the French troops at Verdun, as German troops were being redirected to hold off the British. The situation was exacerbated for von Falkenhayn when he additionally learned that the Russians were also beginning to put more pressure on the Central Powers in the east. On July 11th, German forces launched their last major offensive of the battle, targeting French forces at Souville. The offensive failed, and with German troops required on other fronts, plans for future large offensives were shelved, with artillery remaining the primary means with which to grind down the French, who were themselves preparing their own counter-offensives. Over the following weeks, von Falkenhayn's efforts appeared to be failing to achieve the goals he set out at the start of the battle, which showed no signs of ending anytime soon. And so on August 28, 1916, he was relieved by Paul von Hindenburg. Von Hindenburg recognized that the intensity of previous operations could no longer be maintained at Verdun, and so he ordered a total cessation of all offensives, instead focusing on consolidating German gains in the face of Nivelle's impending counterattack. The counterattack came on October 24th, following a 5-day preliminary French bombardment. On the first day alone, the French advanced 2.9 kilometers or 1.8 miles, an impressive figure in the context of the battle, and their morale skyrocketed at the news that Fort Douaumont had been recaptured. Nivelle continued pushing back at the overextended Germans into the cold nights of November and into December, when on December 15th, another major offensive pushed German forces back almost to their February 1916 positions. With Hindenburg still ordering a pause on offensive operations, the Battle of Verdun was effectively over by December 18th, 1916. The French had held the city, and von Falkenhayn's goal of bleeding France white had failed, denying German victory on the Western Front. The Battle of Verdun slogged on for 9 months, 3 weeks and 6 days, making it the longest battle of the First World War. The battle has since become ingrained in the French military psyche as a demonstration of French grit and determination in the face of the enemy, to the point where one of the enormous Char B-1 tanks of the Second World War sported the name Verdun. However, to the wider public, Verdun is associated more with the brutality of war, and rightly so, for while von Falkenhayn failed in his aim to destroy the French army, it still suffered an appalling 163,000 troops killed, and a further 216 wounded. For their efforts, the Germans lost 143,000 of their own, and a similar number wounded. But since they were beaten back to their pre-battle positions, Verdun is viewed as a victory for the French. Following the Second World War and the massive socio-political changes which took place across Western Europe, Verdun became a symbol of Franco-German reconciliation. In a gesture of peaceful relations in this new era between the two sides, on September 22, 1984, the then West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and French President François Mitterrand stood at the Douaumont Cemetery where they held hands for several minutes in driving rain. This powerful gesture signified a laying to rest of the pain caused in the past, ushering in a more peaceful and prosperous future for the two nations, now working together.